if you let industries go through this setup for this mandatory disclosure regime without having this requirement, it means that there has to be a whole nother process to amend the standard, to get everybody to change their practices and approaches. So it's really timely right now.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land, and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders past and present. In this episode, we will talk about investment banks and insurers. Should they be exempt or not to the new reporting standards designed to lift the veil on the risks relating to Scope 3 emissions? And if not, why not? To give us some insights on a greenwashing loophole that the industry needs to address is Alison George, Chief Impact and Ethics Officer at Australian Ethical. Alison, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle.
Now, first of all, for those who are unfamiliar with Australian Ethical, although, of course, I'm very familiar with Australian Ethical, can you give us a brief background on the work that you do there and kind of the size of Australian Ethical and the products that you offer?
Sure. So I'm the Chief Impact and Ethics Officer for Australian Ethical Investments. We've been investing for a better world for people, planet and animals since 1986. Currently, we manage about $13 billion in funds under management. Superannuation is a key component for us, but also managed funds and ETFs increasingly across the full suite of asset classes.
13 billion, that's such a small number, isn't it, Alison? Just a little bit of money that you kind of put towards for a better world. So we're specifically talking about the new accounting standards and specifically on Scope 3 emissions. And I want to know why this is part of your submission to the industry body in charge of this. So walk us through that.
Sure. So we're calling on the Australian Accounting Standards Board to prevent a loophole from being opened up in the climate disclosures for insurers and investment banking. So the amendments that have been moved to the climate disclosure standard that's coming in progressively in Australia from next year will mean that insurers and investment banks won't need to disclose the emissions associated with those core business activities. And we think that that's an important transparency that every other business, every other financial institution is making, and we think that it's important for insurers and investment banks too.
Is there a reason why they get an exemption or that they're not required to do it?
So the claim is that there's a lack of agreed methodologies. So there are methodologies, but there hasn't been a consensus about what's the right one. But providing an exemption now means that there'll be no motivation to develop those methodologies.
Right.
And we think that there are ways to provide useful information in the interim rather than simply carving them out.
Yes. And is there a problem as well with double counting? Is that also one of the reasons where they feel like, oh, how do we kind of attribute this? You're laughing, so our listeners can't see this, but you're kind of going, no, Michelle.
No, well, what I was saying is a climate disclosure embraces double counting. So this is why we have the different types of emissions categories, which every reporting entity will be getting used to. So Scope 1 are the things that you do directly in your own operations. Scope 2 is the electricity that you buy. And Scope 3 is everything else along your value chain. So inherently it's double counting, but it's still really important to understand because it's about, do you have emissions intensive products that you're selling on down the value chain, or do you have emissions intensive inputs? And that really informs the risk profile in meaningful ways. So carving it out into a separate category says, yes, this is double counting, but it's important information.
All right. Okay. I see what you mean. So to recap, we really don't want to provide a kind of an exemption because there'll be a lack of motivation to get the metrics right, to get some sort of consistency and agreement on the methodologies on this. So I can see that from that perspective. But why is it bad for investors?
So there is revenue at risk for those investment banks and insurers who fail to move their client books towards lower carbon activities as the world transitions. And there's also reputation risk because no new big fossil fuel development is going to get up without there being an insurer and investment bank involved. And that role in locking in future emissions leaves them exposed reputationally. It's actually a big part of why investment banks and insurers tend to be cagey about their high emissions customers. And we want to know that the investment banks and insurers are recognising these risks and encouraging their customers to reduce emissions. We think that requiring transparency can encourage this, as it has with investors and commercial banks who are actively talking to those in their portfolios and those that they lend to about how they align with a low carbon future.
Now, investors always love numbers and figures. Are there any research or forecasts perhaps that kind of will strengthen the argument for disclosure, or any kind of risks that we can't mitigate without this kind of disclosures?
So it's a fairly an area that hasn't had a lot of light shed on it historically because a lot of the information is commercial in confidence and relatively sensitive. So when you think about commercial banks, for instance, they've for a long time had to disclose lending by sector. Insurers and investment banks don't do that. So it's a real blind spot, actually, which is part of why it's so important that it doesn't get left out of this next phase of mandatory disclosure, that we find a way to shed some light on the risks that sit in this space.
All right. So let's talk about solutions. We're saying that this is important. So what can be done? And are there any financial metrics that are accessible or that can be used around this area?
That's exactly the answer, I think, Michelle. So if emissions estimates are not an option for now, then reporting the activities in dollar terms and by industry becomes a really good proxy for the emissions. And it's really similar to that example that you see in banking under the Pillar 3 disclosures, where they set out their activities in those different industry groups. So sector level disclosure would protect client confidentiality while still substantially increasing the understanding of the risk exposures that different organisations have.
And you've kind of touched on this in terms of what would be the benefits, but also perhaps the disadvantages if we proceed with this potential loophole. But anything else, like what's the best case and worst case scenario should your submissions or no changes are made to the current reporting requirements?
So I suppose the best case is that insurers and investment banks choose to be transparent, even though no one is making them. So maybe you can estimate your own odds of the chances of that happening. The worst case is, well, this isn't a temporary measure, right? It would be a permanent exemption. So the worst case is that investors are left blind on which investment banks and insurers are flying into a climate headwind and enabling more climate destruction through their activities.
Now, I know that success doesn't happen overnight, and even if the ASSB has done a lot of work on this, if suppose they say, oh yes, we don't want this to become a problem later on and we'll fix it, what kind of timeline would they work on this? Can this be like an immediate fix, or is it another year or another 2 years before they can make the change?
It's really simple right now to change these proposals into something more workable before the reporting regime comes in. So it's really only beginning to roll out over next financial year and the years thereafter. We think that financial breakdowns by customer is something that's really quite easy to do. It builds on what the standard already says. It brings insurers and investment banks into line with commercial banks and investors who already provide this kind of transparency. So it's something that if we do it now, kind of stitch in time, then we can set it up for success from the outset. If you let industries go through this setup for this mandatory disclosure regime without having this requirement, it means that there has to be a whole nother process to amend the standard, to get everybody to change their practices and approaches. So it's really timely right now.
it's great to see Australian Ethical really championing this, and you're out there talking to your investors, to your community, that this is a potential loophole that we don't want to go ahead. Any other asset owners or anyone else who are also vocal about this particular issue?
So these changes to the standard have been pitched as minor technical amendments. So what I've found is that actually not many people have noticed that this change is coming through, but everyone that I've spoken to and highlighted it to has been surprised and concerned that this loophole has been opening up.
Yes, it's always in the detail, isn't it? That you find this. This is like the one big beautiful act bill where the revenge tax is kind of tucked away on page 398. Any other thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners on why this is important to be discussed, debated, and hopefully amended?
So the main thing to say is simply that there's still an opportunity to comment on this. So really the key process here is what's happening with the International Sustainability Standards Board. They've got these changes out for consultation and everyone's welcome to submit. They close by the end of June.
Fantastic. Well, we'll share that definitely on our show notes. Alison, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle. It's been a pleasure.
This is The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.